Good afternoon and welcome to Colonial Williamsburg's live stream for Historic Trades Tuesdays. I'm Ken Schwarz, I'm a master blacksmith, and I'm joined by a couple of colleagues today. We're going to be discussing apprenticeship. So when we look at apprenticeship, it's a system that was used in the 18th century for training people in hand skills, and it's similar to the system that we use today within historic trades. Traditionally, a young person in their mid-teens would be contracted. They would sign an indenture that bound them to a particular workshop until they were 21. And in those years, from their mid-teenage years till they're 21, they would learn the skills of the work by actually participating in the workshop. In learning a skill like this, a skill that involves hand coordination, judgment, and a knowledge base as well, it's easiest to learn from somebody who's a mentor, somebody who's already skilled at it, not unlike learning to play a musical instrument or learning to cook or learning a sport. It's a period where you have supervised practice. We use a similar system today as we try to preserve our trades within historic trades. Joining me today are two apprentices, and I'm going to let them introduce themselves.
I'm Ellie Bain. I'm an apprentice weaver in the weaving, spinning, and dyeing shop, so I actually do apprentice in all three trades. I've been there for several years now, coming up on 3 years, and just learning that trade, getting used to it. And it is very much like it was in the 18th century, when we're going through kind of a curriculum and we're expected to follow certain steps to be able to move our way up in our apprenticeship and eventually strive to become a journeyman within that trade, and in the 18th century make money off of that as well. But
I'm John Peeler. I'm an apprentice cabinet maker. I've been here at Colonial Williamsburg for about a year and a half or so, and have been working wood with hand tools, 18th century hand tools, for almost a decade now. As a cabinet maker, I'm a furniture maker, fine furniture, expensive stuff, both today and back then. Also chairs, that sort of thing, any kind of higher-end furniture that you would need, usually made out of pretty fashionable woods. But that's what we do at the cabinet shop, Hayes Cabinet Shop here in Colonial Williamsburg. I hope you visited before. I might have seen your face. But that's what I do here, and as a little extra into that, we also do most of our own carving, which is considered a subset trade within the 18th century world.
Well, John, Ken, and Ellie, thank you all for joining us today, and thanks everybody at home for watching. Please send in questions for our panelists. Let's start with straightforward questions. Why, without a straightforward answer, why would a shop take on an apprentice in the 18th century?
Well, historically, a workshop, especially a large, prosperous shop, is going to want laborers within the workshop. And in the manufacture of different types of goods, there may be various skill levels involved. And one of the cheap and easy ways to have an employee would be to take on an apprentice. An apprentice isn't free labor, but they don't earn cash wages. So the shop is obligated under the terms of an apprenticeship to provide room and board and education. Some of our guests think that means it's free labor, but feeding and clothing a teenage boy while they're learning is not an inexpensive endeavor. But that gives us some inexpensive, semi-skilled labor that can do some of the simpler tasks. And the simpler tasks, of course, become the foundations for the more complex tasks. So a workshop like ours would be taking on young people like that to provide that semi-skilled labor. You all have experience. What attracted you to become an apprentice?
well, for me, I started in an apprenticeship fairly young, which is more similar to the way it would be in the 18th century, but you see that a little bit more rarely today. A lot of people go through the college training first, get a degree, and then end up in the foundation here. But for me, I started as a full-time apprentice right out of high school. And actually, prior to that, I was actually a junior apprentice, which is a fully funded position that is directed towards children or kids still in high school. Trying to kind of give them an idea of what an apprenticeship would be like versus maybe going to college and getting a degree and going through that 4-year college training. But for me, yeah, I was very attracted to it because of the handwork. I'd much rather be working with my hands, talking to people, being able to be with people than actually sitting at a desk and working on a computer. And that's just personality-wise. But for me, that's really what attracted me, was being able to work with my hands and create, and then have those last and be able to pass on that knowledge to other people as well.
Yeah, I kind of had a kind of a curvy way here to Williamsburg. By my college training and most of my experience in my teens and 20s, I was a music teacher. I taught for 6 years in the public schools of North Carolina. Chorus, middle school chorus. Get through that, you can get through anything. But I enjoyed it, but I really started developing this hobby of working with wood and with hand tools and not cheating, no power tools. Nah, just kidding. But anyway, I developed a love for it, much like Ellie, and the fruits of the labor, that kind of thing, and eventually turned that into a really small business, and then an apprenticeship came open here at Colonial Williamsburg, and I jumped at the chance. But I always look back, both as a woodworker and as an interpreter of history, at my teaching years and relating things to people and talking to people, young and old, in a way that is meaningful to them. And that's not always an easy thing to do, but when it's good, it's really good. And it's important these days. We think so, at least. So.
And for me, although I'm a master of a shop now, I started as an apprentice. I began blacksmithing when I was in high school. I had the chance to try it and just fell in love with the work right away. I worked for a blacksmith for a number of years. I set up my own workshop, did some work on my own, and then joined Colonial Williamsburg in 1982 as an apprentice. Earned my status as journeyman, and then eventually became master of the shop.
So now that we know something about you and your paths into apprenticeship and beyond, what about apprentices in the 18th century? Where did they usually come from? Were they boys, girls? Bridget was curious about how old were they when they started? Are we talking about single digits or teenagers? But class, race, who were apprentices?
You want to start with
Yeah,
that, Ellen?
sure. Well, particularly for the weaving trade, it is a little bit different for my trade. But most often you do see boys as weavers starting around the age of 13 or 14 or so. And that's so that they could be finished with that full 7 years of training within that trade before they turn the age of 21 or by the time they turn 21. So that's typically what we see in weaving, is boys learning that trade and then completing it by the age of 21. Now, here in the colonies, it is a little bit different. You do actually see a lot of enslaved people on plantations apprenticing to become a journeyman. Now, it's going to be a journeyman in a little bit of a different sense. They will not be paid as a journeyman weaver, but they will go through somewhat of the same training as an apprentice would back in England. They would have been taught by an indentured servant that would have been hired over from England to come over and actually train the enslaved people on that property to be a weaver. And that is most often how we do see it here in the colonies, pertaining to weavers at least. But it's going to be different for every trade.
Yeah, it truly is. In the wood trades, very frequently, there's a physical, of course, there's always a physical element, but, our workbenches are at such a height. We don't have, kids' benches, so most of the indentures in the wood trades usually start somewhere not so dissimilar from the weavers, somewhere that 14, 15, 16 range. And we do see some variations in that, perhaps where an apprentice might have been apprenticed to a different trade that didn't work out, or some situation there, so they start later. But most of the time it's a 5, 6, 7 year apprenticeship. There are some outliers that are much longer, but there are also some that are shorter. and it depends on the trade as well. I think at the end of the day, how long does it take to become proficient enough to say that you are worthy of being a journeyman in the trade? And when you're working 60 plus hours a week as an apprentice, doing this trade and hopefully learning this trade from the master and journeyman in the shop, then does it really take 5, 6, 7 years? Maybe not, to learn how to flatten a board, not so long. There are some subtleties that get worked in there that are really good, but at the end of the day, I think that you are very much working to prop up this industry, especially when you're an accomplished apprentice, later teens and early 20s, just before your freedom dues are up. So that's building into the economy of a very labor-intensive environment.
And I would add 2 things. Apprenticeship was also often a way that a community dealt with poor and orphan children. That we do have sort of outlier apprenticeship indentures that survive where people were apprenticed at a very, very young age, where they're not physically capable of doing the work. And why would they have that apprenticeship? The church had responsibility to identify poor and orphan children within the community. And instead of setting up an orphanage, they would be apprenticed into a trade, because that provided a stable family environment for the young person and taught them a skill until they reached legal age, and then they could go out and support themselves. The other point I would make is that these are family businesses, and so the idea that all the workers were boys, we find examples of women who take over operation of a business at the death of their husband, and that suggests to me that the woman's been involved with the trade all along. So you do see women getting involved as part of the family business. And as Ellie pointed out, there were a number of enslaved people who were also apprenticed into a trade to learn a skill.
Sandy was curious about literacy and apprentices. Were they required to know how to read and write before entering their apprenticeship, or is that expected to be taught to them as apprentices?
I think it's, all situations are different for sure, Sandy. There's very frequently in the indenture, which is the literal contract, piece of paper, that gives details on what the master is agreeing to offer to the apprentice and vice versa, back and forth. There are very frequently, there's language in there that they will learn how to read and write and do sums to the advancement of the rule of 3, which is this kind of weird way to say, if you can do proportions. So 2 is to 3 as 4 is to 6. So it's kind of comparison like that. But reading and writing is very frequently in there. I think it's fair enough to say that a lot of young people probably learned reading and writing at home as well, just like they do today. A lot of young people, before they even get into their first lessons in school, in public school today, they learn some things at home, at least in an ideal situation. But I'm sure that there are lots of different situations, both back then and today still.
And in an apprenticeship indenture, often the clauses are common enough that the indentures were printed up and they just leave blank spaces to fill in. So you can fill in names and dates and various provisions, the name of the trade. And then there's a section that's a large section that's left blank. So if there are any additional provisions that are added to a typical apprenticeship, that can be thrown in on the indenture. And one of the things we periodically see is when the apprentice signs the indenture with an X, indicating that they were illiterate, it's often written in specifically that they're to be taught to read and write as part of that apprenticeship.
Maybe we could go into a little more depth on the indenture and sort of what are the expectations that the master has from the apprentice and vice versa.
Yeah, I somewhat mentioned it a little bit before, but today, which is somewhat similar to the 18th century as well, we are to follow a curriculum. And this is somewhat of a self-paced curriculum where you're going through these steps and you're learning this trade, but before you can learn another step of a trade, you have to start with something at the very beginning. So in a weaving trade, one of the first things that a young weaver would learn to do is actually how to quill. And that is actually taking yarn from a larger package like a cone or a tube and winding it onto a smaller paper tube that would be put directly into a shuttle. I have a shuttle right here, and this actually holds that yarn, and that will be sent back and forth, putting in that horizontal stripe of yarn in a piece of fabric. So that's a small job, easy job that an apprentice would learn, and that's going to be one of the first things they'll learn. But they're going to build on that. Eventually, as you get up to your 7th year, you're going to be able to probably work that loom by yourself, set it up, and be able to know the in and outs of the entire trade. But that's going to take time. So within that indenture, it may be written, you will learn this at this point in time before you learn this, and you'll build on top of that. So,
And interestingly, there also there's a section that sort of gives moral guidance to a young person. That, for example, you're not allowed to you're not allowed to gamble. You're not allowed to attend playhouses or taverns. You can't drink. You can't fraternize with others. You can't get married. And part of the reason for that is that I think raising a good citizen was part of the objective. Not only a skilled worker, but somebody that fit in with the community mores of the day. And then also, in terms of gambling or marriage or things like that, the master has taken over responsibility for raising this young person. And if they get into debt, the master then is responsible for that debt. And as the master, I don't want to take on somebody's gambling debts. So it's interesting to look over an apprenticeship indenture and see all the different clauses. And then typically from the master's standpoint, the statement is something along the lines of, you are to see that the young person is taught, or that they're caused to be taught, the skills of the trade. And then it says, and provide sufficient meat, drink, lodging, and washing. So you get a place to sleep, you get your food, you get basic laundry facilities, and your basic needs are met.
Dominic was curious about how many apprentices might be in one shop at any given time.
That's a good question. We have an ad that was run by James Anderson, who operated the blacksmith shop here in town. So these are ads that were in the Virginia Gazette during the Revolutionary War. And of course, during the war, the demands are shifting and the shop is growing and the workforce is becoming larger and more complex. And you can see in the ads that James Anderson asked for 8 or 10 healthy boys as apprentices. So you can imagine the scaling up that's happening during the war. So not only does he take on apprentices, there were skilled enslaved people that were brought into the workshop. There were some Scots Highland prisoners of war that were working in the shop. There were some French armorers that were there under contract with Benjamin Franklin had worked out with some entrepreneurs from France. So it was a very complex work environment and drew from many people of different cultural backgrounds.
Angelique was curious about apprenticeship in England with a strong guild system and then colonial America. How different was it between these places?
Yeah, that's a good question. The differences can be very dramatic sometimes. In Europe, the labor market is much different than what it is over here in the colonies. Labor is much, they're just more people in England. So the guild system is there to try and regulate things. It can be very, very specific which guild you belong to and which guild you train in, that sort of thing, and what you're allowed to do. And some of that transfers over here to the colonies, both culturally and legally. Remember, these indentures are considered fairly legal documents. You are bound to that master, and that master is bound to you to fulfill your apprenticeship. and sometimes that ends up in court. But back to your question, it's really quite different sometimes. We think that indentures might not have even been drawn up at all if there is a family situation of an apprentice, with a cousin or an uncle or something like that. Sometimes in the bigger cities, Philadelphia, Boston, New York, that sort of thing, you see a more structured look at apprenticeship, and they are documenting things a lot better. But it is worth noting that actual apprentice indentures are pretty rare to find. There is only one that we know of from my historical shop, the Anthony A. Cabinet Shop, and that is from the 1770s for a James Tyree. And I can guarantee you there were more than one apprentices in the 25 or so years that shop was open. So there's no record. There might have been at one time, and those were lost. But it's a much lighter system compared to the English system and the European ideals at large.
We have a question from Caroline. She's curious to know what would happen if it wasn't working out, if one master and the apprentice weren't getting along and the master wasn't interested in keeping a particular apprentice on. What happens? Are they stuck? Or?
Hey, Caroline, I've encountered that myself as the master of a shop when somebody wasn't quite working out, and I'm sure it happened in the time period also. Because you've signed a legal indenture in many of these cases, the way you would undo that legal indenture was through the court system. And you do periodically see the owner of a business, the master, going to court to have an indenture broken because the young person just wasn't up to the work or wasn't applying themselves. But you also, the apprentice also has legal recourse. So I recall an example of one where the apprentice took the master to court saying that the master had him working in a tobacco field and not in the workshop. So undoing a legal agreement like that was usually handled through the courts.
Sometimes apprentices go bad, and sometimes the situation goes bad too. I would be really remiss if I didn't mention this one little anecdote that we know about, interestingly from an autobiography of a guy named Thomas Johnson, and it's from the 1790s, but he was an apprentice in the 1770s. And I'm just going to read it out to you because it's a great story. This is in his words, a real 18th century apprentice. And he says, one day, having some work I knew not how to go on with, he was a carver, by the way, I told my master he did not do me justice, having served 6 years and no opportunity of learning more than I knew the first 6 months. So he's not a very happy guy right now. And if he did not procure some means for my improvement, I would run away and go to France. He was English. Go to France. Upon this is where it gets saucy. Upon this, he struck me, and though I had often felt his blows before, I was now predetermined, if he struck, to strike again. Provoked at the blow, which was a pretty hard one, I returned it in his face, the receipt of which made his nose bleed. Unfortunately for me, a hair broom standing near, my mistress, so the master's wife, broke my head with it. Upon this, my fellow apprentice knocked her down with his fist. Her brother, so the mistress's apprentice, being in the house, joined the fray, and a battle royale ensued. Now, to abridge things, everything turns out okay for Thomas Johnson, but it is quite the situation, and at least a good story, This was before cross-editing and fact-checking, but I'd like to think it happened, and it's a good example of when a master did not live up to his end of the bargain of teaching an apprentice, and that's not just, somebody wanted to know how to carve better. They need to know how to carry on their trade if they want to get a job as a carver in the coming months for Mr. Johnson there. So things can go quite wrong.
So he ran away for a short time, but we 18th century newspapers are littered with runaway apprentice ads. Can you tell us about what's some of those, or what's going on in that situation? What might have motivated folks to run away?
Yeah, I think the situations we mentioned, that if you're not learning, or if the young person's being abused in the process, one of their options is to run away. And typically, if you're going to run away, you want to run fast and far, because if you run away and you've been apprehended, of course, there's a contract there. The master then has some recourse. If you're captured and returned, then typically they would double the amount of time you were away and add it to the end of the apprenticeship. And then any expense that the master had to incur in gaining your return, you had to repay. So if you stole something, if there was a reward offered for your return, the cost of transporting you back to the workshop, all of those things you'd have to repay the master of the shop. And I think you had a fun story that had to do with rewards, right?
Yeah, well, I think we have we might have the actual image of a runaway ad from a Benjamin Bucktrout, who's a cabinet maker in the hay shop here in Williamsburg. And you probably can't read it very well, but it does say, run away from the subscriber in Williamsburg, and they mean from Benjamin Bucktrout, all that good stuff. A lad about 20 years of age, about 5, so he describes the person and mentions that he ran away not only with, of course, the clothes that he was wearing that Mr. Bucktrout provided, but also with additional clothes. And we see a number of years later, I believe in 1775, that Benjamin Bucktrout puts out another ad where at the end of it he is looking for apprentices again, actually 2 apprentices for his shop and right before the war. And he mentions that he essentially, in so many words, that he is only looking for apprentices that are providing their own clothes. Very specifically, he mentions this. So he's a little bit jaded from that experience, and I guess I would be too, knowing what textiles are what they are. So.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's actually kind of going into that. The runaway ads is where we do get so much information about normal clothes in the 18th century and what the everyday type of person was wearing, because usually those aren't left over because they are worn down into nothing. So yeah, we do go off of runaway ads, even apprentice runaway ads, to see what was an apprentice weaver wearing in the 18th century, or an apprentice blacksmith. So especially if we are trying to make clothing or fabric that is to be used in our trade shops, we go off of those runaway ads to be able to recreate those fabrics as accurately as possible.
One of the things we find in our work, there is a blacksmith runaway ad with the description of the clothing, and it says specifically, he's a runaway blacksmith. He was wearing a white linen shirt burned full of holes in the front. And we find that in our work, we produce the same sort of result with our white linen shirts.
So when we look at this as historians, we, of course, the content of the indenture, the runaway ad is important in that somebody felt the need to leave everything that they knew in this world to go somewhere else and seek out their fortune elsewhere. But it really does tell us a lot of, I guess the word today would be metadata about what the situation is. And we have so little of that from the 18th century. There's no social media to document people's lives. So we really hunt that stuff down, and it's very precious to us when we get it. So.
A question from Christian. So we spoke about orphans and more working class children. He was curious about wealthier children. Were they entering into apprenticeships? And if so, were the details different? Were they treated differently?
Well, I would assume that they were treated somewhat differently, probably. I don't know too much about actually gentry class going into a weaving trade too much, because again, it is very different here in the colonies, actually what we study versus in England. But we do typically see more so of that happening on plantations, the weaving, but maybe I'll let you all.
Yeah, and you may have noticed we made reference to some of the fundamentals of things like reading and writing being taught at home. When you visit Colonial Williamsburg, one of the things you'll notice is the only school in the town is the College of William and Mary. And typically that's where the gentry went. The gentry went to learn a more formal type of education like that. Because part of what marks you as gentry is that you don't have to work with your hands. It's an intellectual pursuit. You're overseeing the labor of others. Now, very often, gentry in adulthood picked up hand skills as a hobby. We know Thomas Jefferson was doing woodwork and metalworking. One of his enslaved workmen, Isaac, referred to the fact that Mr. Jefferson liked to make door locks or furniture locks, and that he was somewhat of an accomplished locksmith. So the gentry tended to pursue these sorts of things as a hobby rather than a profession.
I have a question from Helena about young women entering apprenticeships. Were there certain areas that were blocked from them, or could they enter into any trade? And then maybe expanding on that, a question we often get from visitors is, how do you know when you've got a 13 or 14 or 15-year-old what they're cut out to do? So how are children and families, how are they making this decision? Do they have information to help them, do that?
Yeah, I'll go ahead and answer the one about the girls entering the trade. With weavers here in the colonies, you're not under that weaving guild system like there was in England. In England, yes, it was very strict. It was probably pretty rare to see a female weaver back in England. It wasn't proper, it was strenuous work. Women are not allowed, or it's not proper for them to do strenuous work. So you don't see them as weavers in England too often. But here in the colonies, we do. About 7% of the weavers in Virginia in the 18th century are women. So it's not a huge number, because there's not a whole lot of weavers, but we do see them. We actually do see 2 enslaved women that actually work for Thomas Jefferson at Monticello. That is Dolly and Mary, actually, and they are working that loom and running the loom. And it is a little bit rare to see that it's actually documented. There's also another apprenticed slave in Princess Anne County, yes. And that is Aggie Cobbill, and Cobbill is actually her owner's last name, but she's apprenticing in that trade as well. So we do see women in the trade of weaving, but it may not be recorded as often. So we do know that they're doing it more frequently than they're writing it down, kind of the same as what you were pointing out, where not all the apprentices are accounted for. But for the most part, they would be learning that trade and doing that trade and be assessing what that female is able to do. And I know for a fact that women are able to work a loom and do that trade fully, and it's not necessarily difficult to do for me. But yeah.
And I also think that you have to try to understand the social customs of the day. And in 18th century society, I think there was an ideal that the head of the household earned the living and provided the living to his family, and to have your wife or your daughter involved in some sort of industrial occupation wasn't the ideal. That wasn't the goal. Today, in fact, we face some of the same things. Very few families today have just a single bread earner in the family. We're used to more and more seeing 2 income households. And sometimes that was necessary in the day as well. So I think when you see a woman in an industrial shop like that, it's a family business, and it's somewhat an indication of financial distress that's requiring that participation. The ideal, though, was to not have to work with your hands.
To speak on deciding, what trade is right for your young person that is looking for an apprenticeship, it could be as simple as there's somebody in your extended family, perhaps local or in another town, that does that trade. Maybe the young person shows a certain proclivity to doing something like that, whatever it may be. We have a couple of documents. There's a book called The London Tradesman. I think we have a still of it, and we can put up the title page of it. That is essentially a kind of a guidebook. So if you have a young person in college, you might have seen a college guidebook where it's discussing different possibilities for the young person, and that's what this does. The London Tradesman is a guidebook to what is expected of apprentices in the different trades, and very importantly, what kind of money they could expect to make as a tradesperson doing that trade. That is for the European side of things, the England side of things. So I'm sure it's a different world over here in the colonies, but that sort of thing is probably in existence in some way. I think in Virginia, a lot of it is going to be what is available. Is if your child wants to be a cabinet maker or a weaver or a blacksmith or something, is there a master in town that's looking for an apprentice? And if the answer is no, then they better pick something else. So practicality comes into it a little bit too, I think.
Well, thank you. Certainly, apprenticeships, it's time for this last question. Entering into an apprenticeship is definitely an aspirational act. Do you all have particular aspirations for your apprentices, Ken, or for apprenticeship in general? John and Ellie, do you each are there things that, what are your big hopes through your apprenticeship? Are there projects coming up that you're really looking forward to? Where are you all headed with this?
Well, I'll start. I do have aspirations for the apprentices in the shop. The real ideal in my mind is to train somebody in an 18th century mindset so that when we go to reproduce something that was made in the time period, that we're using a very similar thought process, we're using the same techniques as far as we can tell, and I want an apprentice to learn the problem-solving areas of the trade, to analyze an original object, to use their knowledge to figure out the process, and then use their skill to replicate that piece. Apprentices here also are required to learn a lot of information and then to be able to synthesize that and share that with our guests. So those communication skills, those analytical skills are also very important. And then for me, one of my favorite aspects of my work is the legacy that I leave behind. And one of the stories I share with our guests periodically is a number of years ago, we were asked to, Bruton Parish Church was restoring the steeple on the church. And at the top of that steeple was a weather vane that was put up there in 1768. And the church decided to preserve that as a cultural artifact and asked us to make a copy of it. So I got to make the copy. And it occurred to me that the first one was up there for almost 250 years. It's not out of the question that the one I made will be there for 250 years. And to be able to have that sort of legacy in your work is really, really exciting to me.
Yeah, that is very exciting. In addition to that, the other weather vane you made as well for at the top of the new museum. Looks
Right.
great. And we'll probably be there for quite a while. But yeah, somewhat of the same for me is being able to make these pieces and them lasting. I recently recreated a piece that we have in our collections. It's a reproduction of a bed rug that was from the 18th century. It's made up of hand-tied knots, and that is now on display in the Wythe House. But being able to just show that and have that piece made new and see exactly what it looked like, or for the most part, what it looked like when it was originally made, and going through those steps of what this weaver did in the 18th century to make this. What he had to learn and what he had to troubleshoot, I had to make those same mistakes to be able to figure it out as well. But yeah, and then moving forward, just excited to become a journeyman, I guess, or be able to get to that point. I've been here for about 3 years, so I've got, a couple more years to go before I'm there, but a couple more big projects coming up that I have to work on, but pretty excited for that.
Same for me in a lot of ways. As an apprentice, I've got a little bit longer to go. That's okay, because we really get to do something really incredible here as apprentices. We get paid to learn. We get paid to discover things that possibly no one else has discovered. If I'm looking at a piece of furniture and I see something on it that even the master or the other journeyman in my shop haven't seen before, and it's like, hey, this might be something that maybe not a lot of people have seen before. That's pretty cool, both as a historian and a tradesperson. And so I think going forward, I am looking forward to not only making nice pieces of furniture and pouring hundreds of hours of my life into something that looks really, really great and that I'm proud of, but just discovering the things that are still left to discover. We know a lot about the past, but we're scratching the surface, and we discover more every day, and that's a big part of what Colonial Williamsburg is here to do, and what we are here to do as apprentices and journeymen and masters of shops, and leading to that. Yep.
Well, John, Ken, and Ellie, thank you all so much for joining us today and sharing your knowledge and experiences with us. Everyone at home, thank you for tuning in and sending wonderful questions and comments our way. Of course, this presentation, like so many others, was made possible by the generosity of our donors. To learn how you can support programs like this, please follow the link pinned in the comments below or visit us at colonialwilliamsburg.org. Do you all have any final thoughts to send us on our way with?
Well, I think you've seen some of the opportunities here, maybe through some of the other Trades Tuesdays, and it's even more exciting if you visit in person and you get to see the sites. It's a real sensory experience. You see the site, you hear the sounds, you smell the smells, you feel the textures, and you can interact with people directly, similar to what we did here today, but even better.
Yeah.
And I'll say, as I mentioned before in the very beginning, my whole first experience of being a junior apprentice was fully donor funded. I would not have been able to do that without the help and support of those donors that did that for me. I would not be where I was here today. So that was very helpful, very thankful for that as well. And even still, we still have a junior apprentice in our shop even today, and that's still being funded. So just really awesome opportunities that are helping younger children grow and be able to realize that you don't have to do the formal college way that most society thinks you have to do today.
You're here, yeah.
But,
So come see us. The Anderson Armory is open 7 days a week. I believe the Weavers are open many days a week as well. My shop's closed, but you can see us at the art museums, which are beautiful and new and wonderful to see. We are there as cabinet makers and harpsichord makers on Wednesdays and Saturdays. So come and see us.